Hello and welcome to a new episode of Inspired Living. My name is Verena, and you can find out more about what I'm up to on my website at www.meinnächsterschritt.de, and you can find the info below. The purpose of this interview series is really for people to see that there is more available to them, that there, you know, things that we often forget in our busy day-to-day lives, that there's so much more that could be exciting in our lives and that could be inspiring. And so what I love to do is to connect with people that I find inspiring and yeah, talk to them about how they live their lives, what's important to them, so that you can perhaps get more ideas of what's possible and out there. So today I'm really happy to have Ren Hurst with me. I yeah, first of all, hello Ren. Thank you for doing this.
Hi, Verena. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Mm, yeah, fantastic that you took the time. I came across you now already a few years ago when I read your first book, Writing on the Power of Others, which is basically your life story up to that point, and yeah, how your life changed radically, like from being a very well-known and successful horse trainer to yeah, to just your whole life changed basically. And what I would love to do today is, yeah, to for you to talk to us how you're living now, what's important to you, and yeah, what you would like to share, basically.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the way I'm living now is pretty challenging. I'm camping basically full time off grid in order to provide the life that I've come to believe is best for the horses in my care. And the only reason I had to make such extreme changes is because my entire identity and career was wrapped up in using and training and riding horses. So when I decided to not do that any longer, there was nothing to replace it with. And, that's okay. We'll get there. But it takes time to rebuild a life starting from nothing, especially when you have a lot of animals in your care.
Mhm.
So currently, in the last year, I was able to purchase a beautiful 80-acre piece of high desert wilderness, basically at the near the base of Mount Shasta, California. And the horses live here in total freedom. And myself, my partner, and one other person who lives separate on the property spend our days caring for these animals. And I spend any extra time writing about what this philosophy has become in terms of a body of work. And I teach others to be in an authentically loving relationship with animals that does not involve or need the use of training, control, coercion, etc.
Wow, that's really amazing. And yeah, I really got inspired to connect with you when I listened to the talk that you did on the vegan festival. I think it was 2017,
Yeah.
and yeah, I just loved how you talked about life, basically. I mean, um, maybe it would be a good idea if you could talk a bit like where you are coming from, what you are sharing in depth in your first book, and just so the people get a bit of a background, like who was Ren before something happened, and how different that is to how the world looks to you now.
Well, I have a lot more understanding and compassion for who Rin was before, but who Rin was before was not a very easy person to know or be around in a lot of ways. I was very good at being popular amongst my peers and people that were learning from me. But I wasn't a very nice person, and I was actually very manipulative, especially under the surface. But I was a professional horse trainer. I was born and raised in Texas. I started seriously riding in my teens, started buying and selling horses in my teens, put myself through college I would basically purchase horses, retrain them, and then resell them for profit. And then as I got older, it turned into rescuing horses and doing the same thing. I would rehab them, retrain them, and resell them for profit. So in my mind, I thought I was doing the horses a favor because I was setting them up to, for one, I was saving their lives most of the time. And number two, then I was setting them up to succeed in better homes than the homes that I was getting them from. And so that's the story I told myself. And then I also became a professional hoof care practitioner and studied with some of the best in the country on how to do the barefoot trim correctly. And we did a lot of really good rehabilitative work, to the point that some of the horses I currently have are from that time, and that the only reason they're here and alive and healthy is because we were able to reverse acute founder diagnoses and things of that nature, things that people didn't really understand back then and didn't want to put in the time and effort to heal. And so I had all of these horses. I had 13 at the time in my business, none of which I really intended to keep forever. They were all very much, it's not like I didn't care about them. We all deeply care about our horses, but they were still seen as my means to support myself and my family. And, you know, they were seen as commodities. And so my path with horsemanship evolved pretty rapidly. I started out learning, you know, the typical cowboy way, and then very quickly moved into the natural horsemanship movement right as it was emerging. So I got to study with the likes of, you know, like Clinton Anderson, really studied deeply Pat Pirelli stuff for a while, things that I look back on now and just shake my head with disgust. You know, all the well-known names in that time I studied and emulated and took what they were teaching and also added it to my own experiences, because I was on horses every single day. And that eventually led me to someone putting the film The Path of the Horse in my hands, which introduced me to the likes of Klaus Ferdinand Hempfling and Alexander Nesterov, which eventually led me to joining NHE, the Nesterov Haute Ecole. Well, through my experiences studying that horsemanship, I went and rescued a stallion that had never been worked with before. He was aged, he was around 6 or 7. Really pretty aggressive tendencies, typical stallion that had not been like cared for well. And through my relationship with him, applying the principles of NHE, and not just from that, there was a lot of other things going on in my personal life and in my own studies in the psycho-spiritual realm and things of that nature. The interactions between he and I didn't make sense based on my experience and understanding as a horse trainer or as an animal trainer in general. The things that this horse were capable of, by relating to him in a much more equal capacity, in leaving room to believe that maybe he was more advanced in his understanding of the world and his way of reacting to us than maybe I had previously thought possible. It shattered my entire reality, not just as a trainer, but my way of life, my paradigm of understanding of how the world worked, of what was true and what wasn't true about how we relate to one another, of love. It basically made me understand from a very visceral standpoint that very few of us know what true unconditional love really is, much less how it plays out in relationship dynamics, even much less how it plays out in the relationship dynamics between a guardian and the dependent in their care. And so that was about 6 years ago, and it's just evolved from there. I'm not a research scientist, but I spend every day practicing this work and experiencing it on many levels with many different animals of many different species, and spending a good time of my days out in the wilderness observing and interacting with wild animals as well. So while I don't have the scientific research background to back up a lot of my work with the articles and the documents and everything else. I live and breathe this, and it's an energetic thing that can actually be seen and repeated consistently enough that I would rather camp full time than go back to having a comfortable life where I'm fooling myself.
Mm, yeah.
So that's
Wow.
kind of where we're at today.
Hmm. Amazing. And I quite find it. I don't mind that there are no proofs, scientific proofs or anything out there, because it's just such a different way to I don't know, to approach the world. What I find important is what is working and what is
Yeah.
changing, you know?
And the science will catch up. There is plenty of
Mm,
science out there to support quite a bit of what I teach and what I talk about.
mm-hmm.
But when I spend my time looking for that and then sharing it, I've wasted all the time actually experiencing it. And
Yeah.
it's the people that can feel this and resonate with it that are actually ready and prepared to do the work,
Mm,
because it is not easy to relate to animals and ourselves and the world at this capacity. It's much easier to control and dominate and domesticate and, live in delusion.
yeah, yeah. And what I would like to talk about a bit is this point, like when you were working with this stallion, what what made you realize, like, do you maybe have an example of where you realized, okay, there is something else going on than what I thought before, and that he is more intelligent, or that just the world is different than I thought, and then what happened there?
It was several things over the course of a pretty short period of time. I was a really experienced horse trainer. So I had trained hundreds of horses, to the point where I was riding completely without equipment and on horses that had never been trained that way, horses that had never met me. I didn't need bridles or halters. I was riding bareback with, at most, a neck rope around their neck in wide open spaces, not just in arenas or in enclosed areas, but to the point where I went to Costa Rica and was invited to ride my host's lead horse, who had lots of training but had never been taken out like this, and rode her through mountains and down beaches with nothing but a neck rope. And I'd just met the horse. And even that person, who was a very well-known, respected, and accredited trainer, was a little blown away. And it had nothing to do with me being special. It had to do with, I understood the power of my energy and intention when it came to getting on the back of an animal, in that it didn't really matter how big that horse was or how much training they had. I knew I could control them to a large degree just based on the the presence that I brought to the situation, and the intention of letting them know, I'm in charge. There, it doesn't really matter what you do. I am very skilled at this. I'm unlikely to get thrown off your back. We're going to do this. And just that direction, energetically and mentally, usually creates a lot of compliance in most horses. It's very easy to control a being that you have that much influence over. It's not like these are free equals that have the ability to consent, that are just going to throw us off if they don't want to be ridden. It's not that simple. We have an enormous amount of psychological control over the beings in our care. And I think that's where a lot of riders really misunderstand how much power they have over the animals in their care, just by the nature of them being a permanent captive dependent. Versus, of course, if I go out into the wild and try to climb on a wild horse, I'm likely to get tossed very quickly, if I could even get close enough to get on.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened with me and the stallion, I was applying the basic principles of NHE, which are very simple. They're, first, do no harm. The horse is always right. And the horse is an exact science. And taken on surface level, that doesn't make a lot of sense to a lot of people, but there is an enormous focus on hippology and understanding the anatomy and physiology of the horse within this school. You have to understand a lot about the science of horses so that you make sure that you're not causing any harm. But the horse is never wrong implies that you have no means to control them. So we are taught to learn the subtlest cue of a no from the animals that we're working with. And a no doesn't look like getting bucked off. It looks like being ignored when you first have the intention to interact. That's the first no. And any woman who has ever been approached at a bar by somebody that they don't want to have a conversation with knows what that first no looks like. It's that freeze. It's that moment where you're like, ugh, that is what you want to look for. And so in NHE, we are taught to look for the no, whereas in most horse training, we're taught to look for the yes, or to coerce a yes, or to turn a no into a yes, or to make the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard. And with what I was practicing with this stallion, none of that was an option. There was no manipulation, no coercion, no control. If he said no, it was like, okay, buddy, no big deal. We're done for the day. And there was no expectation, no agenda. You went out with an idea of what we might work on that day, but it very much felt more like a lesson between a student and their teacher, or a parent and their child. It felt like education, not training. And what he was able to respond to with no training aids, no reinforcement, positive or negative or otherwise, other than how it made me feel as his teacher, that's all I had. And he was learning things and engaging in things that were much more advanced than a lot of my other training horses without any reason to, other than he wanted to. And it didn't always go smoothly. When I wanted to exert control, he responded very aggressively. And there were many times where I left his area because I either was afraid of getting hurt, or I had gotten a big no and basically told to get the hell out of there. And it, for a horse trainer, it was like a brain fry. It didn't compute how I was doing the opposite of what I had spent 15 years teaching myself not to do. I was taught to enforce boundaries and demand respect, all of which are completely ridiculous topics that you don't demand respect, you earn it. And respect isn't what the horse training world is selling. That's submission, no matter how kind it appears to be. And so with this horse, I was practicing genuine respect. And the things that he was capable of learning, to give you an idea, within 15 minutes, one of our lessons was to teach him different shapes and colors. And the way we approached this was the same way I would with a 5-year-old child, or maybe a younger child, actually. And he learned it very quickly, didn't make a single mistake. I brought out 3 objects of the same object, and they were in 3 different colors. And I basically presented them, and, it's like, this is this color, this is this color, this is this color. And I would mix them up and place them around the arena in different areas. And I'd say, Shay, can you show me where the purple bucket is? And he never got it wrong. And there was no positive reinforcement. There was no treat. There was no reward. It was just, the only reward was, wow, great job, you did it. And just my enthusiasm and the energy behind that, because we had such a real, authentic relationship, was enough to motivate him to want to please me. But that's just one example. There were so many where I realized, first of all, they're capable of far more than we give them credit for. And second of all, what the hell are we doing controlling and manipulating these animals and keeping them as slaves in our backyards? And it broke my heart. And I couldn't continue making money at the expense of others.
Wow. Oh gosh, Ren, there's so much in there.
Yeah. That's why I wrote a book about it. It's a lot to unpack.
Amazing, really. I think one of the big things in there is this, what comes so easily to us because we're used to the control in our society, that's so normal, kind of, I don't know. There are structures and everything is, I don't know, about control, really. It seems so normal, not natural, but normal to have this tendency to wanting to control. And it's like really in all these mini little things and the big ones, like when we are working with our horses. And even though I know about that, I still find it difficult to not go down that path, especially when I'm with horses and they are like having their own ideas. Like I have my ideas and they have their own ideas, and then not trying to 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 use what I know about how I could kind of make them consent, to not
Yeah.
do that. That is such a challenge sometimes.
Well, it's all about fear. I mean, that's where this unnecessary
Mm.
control comes from. We're a terrified society. We're so far removed from our natural wild selves, essentially, that we feel like we have to control the world around us, including other beings, in order to get our needs met. We've completely lost touch with how interconnected all life really is and where our real power comes from. And what's interesting about all of this for me is that the reason I know this so well is because I was a horse trainer. All it means to be a horse whisperer is to be in tune with the energy in the dynamic between you and the horse that you're working with, and you recognize very quickly how powerful that is. You can influence that horse around you, underneath you, etc., just by changing your own energy. Well, I'm applying that same philosophy to life now. I'm just not using it in a way to dominate, and that's the only difference. And it just blows my mind that more people aren't willing to play with that a little, just because they still don't believe that they can get their needs met without doing so. I mean, yeah, my life has been a struggle the last 5 years, but only because of how many animals I had in my care when I decided to walk away from that career. Had I had a non-horse related career or some other means to pay my bills, like if I had remained married to someone who also had a paycheck, or there's a million other ways I could have continued to thrive with this knowledge if there would have been other resources to support such a change. I just really took a giant leap with
Mm.
no paycheck to back up the decision I made.
Mm. Yeah, I love what you're saying about these, that we are not so connected to the wild, how did you say it? Our wild selves,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Like, how does it look to you now? How does a human life look like when we are more connected to our wild self?
It looks present. That's the main thing. Instead of focusing on what's happened or what could be, you're here. You're here and you're here now. And it's not a mental concept. It is not the kind of presence that is being sold on bookstore shelves a lot of times today's world. I mean, that's relevant, but being present and being wild is a fully embodied state. So it means learning how to grieve all the traumas of your past. And not mentally grieve, physically grieve, like process that long held emotion through the body the way that an animal does when they're in an unencumbered state, the way that a wild animal is much more easily able to than a captive dependent that is constantly taking on the emotional traumas of their primary caregivers. And that's where this work begins to get really complicated, because that's the area that people aren't looking at.
Mm-hmm. And can you say how your life has changed now since you are living more from your wild self?
I still have old past tendencies, personality traits that don't work in my favor, habits. The difference now is I also have an enormous space within me to decide to engage habitually the way I used to be, or make conscious choices that determine my outcomes and my experience of the world. I have access to a power within me that I didn't know existed previously, whereas before I um, exerted power over others out of insecurity, out of whatever. Now I don't feel dependent upon anyone. That doesn't mean that I isolate from anyone or anything. It just means that I know how to meet my own internal emotional needs, and I no longer have to derive them from animals or partners or people in general. And that is huge. I know how to grieve now. I know how to overcome trauma. None of this is easy. It takes time. It's a lot of layers of conditioning we're reversing to get back to a more wild self. Yes, I live in the wild, but that's because I love this environment. I love being around wild animals. That is my choice. I could just as easily be wild in a Manhattan apartment. if I were
Mhm.
choosing to do the same work.
Mm. Wow. It's just amazing. And what I get from that, there's like a lot of freedom in there, you
Yeah,
know?
enormous freedom. The freedom
Yeah.
that we give to those in our care reflects the freedom that we're giving ourselves. I mean, there's a lot of hidden costs with domestication that, yeah, we're getting needs met, but are we being our potential? Are we being the self that we came here to be? Are we creating the life that we want in a way that is not detrimental to others and the world around us? And there's enormous freedom. We just have to have a little bit of faith that we might be more than what we think we are as human beings.
Mm. So when there's someone contacting you and they are like in a normal life, with having a job, a 9 to 5 job, and living in this Manhattan apartment. mm, So what could they do to live more of their wild selves and to experience more this freedom?
I think it starts with how we relate to those in our care. So the dependents that basically we control every aspect of their lives. That's our children and our animals, whether that's a hamster, a dog, a horse, whatever. The species is completely irrelevant where this work is concerned. And the only reason I wouldn't immediately direct someone to themselves, which you would think you have the most control over,
Hmm.
is because most people are so out of touch with themselves that that's actually harder than changing some of their practical dynamics with the animals and the kids in their home. So I start with that, and I teach them a set of 13 principles to start working towards a more authentic relationship that doesn't involve unnecessary control. And one of the things that you hear a lot when people just kind of get a snippet of this and haven't actually explored it or learned more is they think that I'm insinuating no control whatsoever. And that is absolutely not the case. You have to control the basic needs and the well-being and the safety of those in your care. So of course those elements of control are still real. What we remove is all forms of control that are exerted as a way for you to get your needs met. So we remove the exploitation involved in training, in basically using the beings in our care to get emotional, physical, or any other sort of needs met. We become willing to step into the full integrity of what it means to be a primary caregiver. We shouldn't be bringing animals and children into our lives to get our own needs met. That's the very root of what's wrong with the world. That's what creates our separation from one another. That is domestication. Domestication is not biology. It is a choice in relationship to another. It is exerting control over another in order to use them. That's the basic definition of what domestication is. So we just remove that. We just stop doing that, and we end the cycle, and we start a concept that could potentially heal the planet if more people would focus on themselves instead of controlling the world around them.
Hmm. And when there's someone who doesn't have an animal or another human being in their immediate environment, how could they then start?
I don't hear from those people as much, and there are a lot of other resources out there. I'm certainly not the first person to talk about the concept of rewilding or undomesticating our lives. There are doing that already that are not focused or have any expertise around animals. And so I would probably direct them to those individuals.
Mhm.
Not that I have a lot of people seeking me out that don't have animals, but
Mm.
I do have a few. But you can do the same work with a house plant if you really want to get serious about the subtle nature of energy.
Yeah. Well, that's an idea. Absolutely.
And I have heard from people that do that, and their plants in their home are thriving in relationship to this energy that they are cultivating in their lives.
Yeah. Oh, fascinating. Yeah. There's just so much more than what meets the eye, and
Yeah,
where really our life comes from. That comes from the unseen world, from the
absolutely.
from the formless. So yeah, that's what I find so fascinating in being with animals, being with nature, because as you said, it's much easier with them to get more in contact with what's behind all that, because they don't have this agenda that we come with. I mean, they do have their
Yeah.
own agenda, they have their own lives, of course, but they are. It's a
They're
different
not trying to
animal.
domesticate anyone
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great
unless
point.
we have taught them to.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Mm.
And there is something really special about this, the animal piece of it, because we are animals. This body is the most technologically advanced piece of communication equipment that we were ever gifted with. And animals intrinsically know that because that's how they experience their world, primary to mentally. We've got it all screwed up. And by working with animals this way, we can actually learn a great deal from them in how to use this body appropriately, and understand that our emotions are so important in terms of what they're teaching us about ourselves and the world around us, instead of these labels we've stamped on them and the avoidance that most of our culture uses to avoid anything uncomfortable and only choose things that feel good. And so as young developing humans, because we are all so exploited by our own primary caregivers, we never become emotionally mature and autonomous ourselves, to the point where most human adults have never learned how to be okay with something that doesn't feel like happiness and joy.
Mm. Yeah. One thing that I think you said it in the Asheville festival thing about um, animals and purpose, that animals don't really have a purpose or something. Is it, did I understand that right? Or
I'm not sure I would have worded it that way. I think I probably would have said something more along the lines of the animal's purpose is to be that animal.
yeah, yeah, that makes more sense. Yeah, I was just puzzled by it, because in our human world, there so often people are looking for their purpose and stuff.
Yeah.
So, um, when you say that the purpose of animals is to be, is do you see a similarity with people? Like how do you see the subject of purpose?
Well, I think our primary purpose is to be authentically here now and who we are. The external purpose that we assign to ourselves is pretty subjective. And when we project that onto an animal who hasn't clearly stood up and said, hey, my purpose is this, then it's made up. Um, I've never seen my horses, for example, more fulfilled than they are now, being their full potential as horses living in freedom, doing their thing. They play, they have all sorts of social structures and groups that didn't exist as fully when they were living a more regimented life that I was controlling, and their hierarchy looked more traditional and what we think is normal.
Mm.
But when the stress is removed, it's so much more dynamic. I mean, they have so much more extensive and deep friendships that change. The bonds aren't based as much on attachment as on a daily basis of, oh, I'm feeling you today, I'm going to play with you today, or I'm going to lay next to you today, or I'm going to eat with you today. And we
Mm-hmm.
see their friends change on a daily basis with a herd of 18, and it's incredible. You just never really know who each one of them is going to be today, because they're free to be whoever they want to be. And I think that's much more purposeful than having a job.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, um, then how has it changed, like your interaction before you had your, I call it an insight, and now, like, what did your day look before, and how does it look now with your horses?
Before, I was under the delusion that we were partners, that we were doing something together. And now I've come to the realization that these are captive dependents, no, not much different than children in my care. So my role to them, of course, I'm their friend, but that's the least of what I am. I am primarily their caregiver. And so I make sure their basic needs are met. I make sure they feel seen. I make sure they feel safe. I make sure that they have what they need. And I'm available if they want to spend time with me, but it's not about me anymore. I go hang out with equally consenting adults that can give me that kind of interaction now. Or I go out in the wilderness and interact with wild animals that are free to walk away and have the ability to say no.
Mm-hmm. So there is no plan, no training.
Not at all.
Mm-hmm.
No. And I'll tell you one thing that's really interesting that I've seen change is to meet their what need would it be? I mean, they don't need me for exercise. They have plenty of room and freedom to move, but you don't even need a lot of space for that. They just need to feel psychologically free so that they move their legs on their own. So it doesn't matter if you have 80 acres or 1 acre. If the animal is healthy and mentally, physically, and emotionally, they're going to make use of whatever space they have. And if they're not making use of it, that's a clear sign that they're in a conditioned, learned helplessness state that doesn't allow them to feel like they can explore their surroundings safely. So there's one horse here in particular that is teaching all of the other horses on every aspect of the hierarchy scale, like from the lowest horse to the highest horse, how to play this stick game that he made up. Like he'll go pick up a stick in the pasture and then get the other horse to take it, and they chase each other around and play tug of war with this stick. And I didn't teach him that, and it's just unbelievable.
Wow, that's amazing. Wow. I mean, this is stuff that, we don't think would happen because we
Yeah,
are not used to that.
right.
Because most of us, we haven't tried that, to just be with the horses and not demanding anything. So
I think that's the most important part that someone has to get through before they can see what's possible. I mean, I didn't set out on this path thinking that this is where it was headed. I set out on this path to try something that was being presented to me to see if something more was possible. And I just gave it faith for a limited amount of time. And in that limited amount of time, it changed my whole perspective. And it was like, wow, this is a real thing. And it's so much better and more fulfilling on a deep, connected level that it didn't matter how successful I was as a trainer or on the back of a horse. Nothing compares to the feeling of this much more authentic love that is appropriate for a guardian dependent dynamic.
wow. So, what is your vision for your sanctuary?
Well, I've got to be honest, with as many animals as I had, there was a period that I'm going to call it post domestication depression, where there was a period in my life where I woke up every done to myself, not because I changed, but because I was the type of person that had this many animals to begin with. And here I am struggling to get by and having to live very minimalistically, which I don't hate, but I don't like being forced to do it in order to care for the animals. Um, but I had to get through that first. And now that we're through that period and I'm back to feeling like, wow, it's a really sincere honor to take care of all of these guys this way. And I'm glad that this is how things went. It's very clear to me that these animals cannot be made available to the public the way most sanctuaries do. That this is like an orphanage. This is a lot of random horses that were rescued at some point, and my primary job in providing sanctuary and being their caretaker is to keep them safe. They are not here to take on the emotional imbalances of humans that need healing. So what we are doing is, for one, providing that safety and security for the animals while we are beginning to develop a section of the property where people can come and visit. But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have access to the animals. The only people I want interacting with the animals are people that are kind of already on this path and already know what it means to be in service to them. So they're here to care for them unconditionally. And yeah, you get lots of benefits from that, but it looks a lot different than going out there with the intention of using them for your healing. And until people can understand that subtle difference, we're not going to allow people just to come be around the healing energy of the horses. I think that's a real slippery slope that not only subtly harms the horses, but it sets the humans up for failure to learn how to heal themselves. So we're going to eventually, when there's funding and all of that for this, build a cabin and a few tiny one-room cabins around it, so that the larger cabin can be a communal facility with like kitchen, hangout area, bathroom, things like that. And people can have a place to come and just unplug from the domesticated world and start, finding a quiet place to land to figure things out and see what is and isn't working for them in their life. And they will have the opportunity to be in service to the animals here, or we live in this incredible environment where they can take part in the wilderness. But it's going to be very trauma informed, and that's a term I just recently came across that put everything into perspective for me. In order to provide sanctuary, we really have to have an understanding of both the trauma that animals bring in and the trauma that the entire human race is a part of.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to hold space and cultivate a place of healing around that, where people can come turn in maybe for the first time and start processing some of the things that happened to them that led to the patterns that would create a lack of empathy with other creatures.
Wow, that's a beautiful vision. Mm. Um, what would you like to see for the rest of the world that is not part of your sanctuary? What would happen in an ideal world for Ren?
For me, I think it would start in each individual home and creating sanctuary there. Because what I think I've seen happening across our entire planet with just about every demographic is we bring animals into our lives to use them, not to provide sanctuary. And it's not until we can provide a safe space for the animals that are dependent upon us that the rest of our home becomes sanctuary too. And by that, I mean, I can't heal myself if I'm using the cat to feel good every time I have an uncomfortable feeling or need somebody to cuddle or whatever we do. We reach for the cat, we reach for the dog, we go climb on the horse. Those are drugs. That is treating the symptom. It is not treating the cause of the problem. And until we start creating sanctuary in our own spaces, there's no chance for sanctuary widespread.
Mm. And how can people start to build such a sanctuary at home?
First, it starts with being willing to turn to solutions that are not an abuse of power. So instead of turning to the cat or the dog who depends on you for their basic needs, it looks like having the hard conversations with the husband or the wife or the family member, or going to a therapist, or reaching for something that is actually an appropriate power dynamic. But my work is a body of work that I'm now teaching that teaches people how to undomesticate the relationship to the captive dependent beings. So I teach a set of relationship principles that people can start applying to. It doesn't matter what species it is. It could be the dog, the horse, the cat. Like I said, it doesn't really matter. But what that does is it teaches you how to not use them emotionally, physically, or otherwise for your own personal needs. Because I think that is the fundamental flaw in a lot of our upbringing, is most of us were not raised by primary caregivers who knew how to love unconditionally. So then we repeat those patterns when we become adults, and we never become emotionally mature, autonomous, or independent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, so where can people go to find out more about the principles that you teach and more about you and your work?
The main place to go is Patreon. I set up an account on that platform. It's patreon.com/rendermewild. That's the only place I'm actively teaching it on a regular basis right now. And while I'm finishing the book, I'm writing a book right now. It's a sequel to my first book that is the literal how-to of what I allude to at the end of the first book. And so the book is going to be the most in-depth, like, manual around this work. But through Patreon, I'm getting people introduced to it. You don't need me. Once you know what the principles are and have a general idea of how to apply them, you can do it self-guided. All I can really do is lend a hand in my own experience and maybe redirect, because I've been practicing it for so long. But I'm just like everyone else. It's a practice. It takes a lot of work to do something different from our lifelong conditioning. And so it's a process of not only undomesticating the animals in our care and the relationship to them, but ourselves in our own lives. So Patreon is the primary place to find that right now. You can find me on Facebook and on Instagram, and I do little snippets of writing a lot on those posts.
Mm-hmm.
But until the book comes out, that's the main way to get a hold of me.
Fantastic. Well, I put all the information about how to connect with you in the show notes as well.
Thank you.
So, well, thank you so much for taking the time and talking about this important, yeah, to give out
Yeah.
your important message. You know, I just find it fascinating. It's just such a different way to look at the world and to look out at the at our partnership, at our connection with other beings. So thank you for that, Ren.
Well, thank you. And I hope people understand that no one would make the sacrifices I've made if this wasn't worth it. There's not a day that goes by where I regret the choices I've made to follow this path, because it has been so incredibly fulfilling
Mm-hmm.
in a deeply connected way, in which all the things I did before, yeah, those felt good too, but it was fleeting and you always needed more of it. Through this work, you touch something inside of yourself that can't be taken away. And I think that's worth moving towards.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much, Ren.
Thank you, Verena.
Bye.
Bye.
Stop the recording.